Hey everyone, I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. Welcome to the channel. In this video, I'm explaining why the puddle analogy fails against the fine-tuning argument. If you want to learn more about apologetics, see productive conversations between Christians and non-Christians, and learn about arguments for God that you didn't even know existed, then make sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on the little bell so you don't miss any new videos. So before we actually get into the puddle analogy, let's get clear on what the fine-tuning argument for God is. It's actually one of my favorite arguments. Well, actually, my favorite argument is the argument from all of the arguments, but this one is really good. A lot of atheists will even admit that the fine-tuning argument is the best argument that theists have.
The teleological argument from fine-tuning, I'm very happy to admit right off the bat, this is the best argument that the theists have when it comes to cosmology.
At some point, certainly, we're all asked, well, which is the best argument you've yet come up against from the other side? And I think every one of us picks the fine-tuning one. As the most intriguing.
The Goldilocks.
Yeah. Okay. Fine-tuning the 1 degree, one hair different to nothing.
So what I'm going to do in this video, first is I'm going to explain the best version, or at least my favorite version, of the fine-tuning argument. Second, we're going to take a very close look at the puddle analogy to the fine-tuning argument. And actually, we're going to be looking at 5 different interpretations of the puddle analogy. And then the last thing we're going to do is look at some responses to these different interpretations. All right, so first, this is the version of the fine-tuning argument that I like the best. Premise 1, the probability that our universe would be life-permitting given naturalism is very, very low. Premise 2, the probability that our universe would be life-permitting given theism is not very, very low. So it follows the fact that our universe is life-permitting provides evidence for theism over naturalism. So for any logic or probability geeks out there, the third premise in this argument follows from the first 2 premises from something called the likelihood principle. If you want to learn more about the likelihood principle, check the description for more details. Now, if you're not familiar with this particular version of the fine-tuning argument, then make sure to check the description. I've linked exactly where I got it from. And by the way, I should mention that I'll be pointing you to the description of this video a lot, so just make sure to check it out at some point. Now, before we actually get into the puddle analogy, let me go ahead and give you a quick defense of both premises in my argument. So the fact that our universe permits the evolution of embodied conscious creatures is actually pretty puzzling. Imagine for a moment that there was no such thing as gravity. Do you think that people like us, or any creatures at all, could evolve in such a universe? The answer is no. There wouldn't even be planets. Matter would just kind of be floating around everywhere. There'd be no stars, no atmospheres, nothing at all resembling what we see here in our universe. No part of our universe would be dense enough to be in the solid phase of matter, so nothing in our universe could be a kind of information storing device. Life needs gravity. But we can't just have gravity. We gotta have gravity at the right strength. If the gravitational constant in Newton's equation was any larger, then the universe would have just sort of collapsed back in on itself almost immediately after the Big Bang. And if the constant were any weaker, then matter never would have coalesced into planets or stars or anything like we see in our universe. It would have just sort of all expanded into nothingness. So not only do we need a universal attractive force like gravity, it has to be set at the exact right strength. Physicists have estimated that the gravitational constant is fine-tuned to 60 decimal places. Any deviation on either side of that would result in a lifeless universe. Now, gravity is just one relatively easy to understand example. If you want to see a longer discussion about all the evidence for fine-tuning, check out the description. I've linked there another conversation I had with an actual cosmologist about all the evidence for fine-tuning. So the question for us is, given that the universe didn't have to be this way, why is it this way? Why does it support life? What's the explanation? On naturalism, the view that nothing like God exists, it's actually pretty surprising that life would exist. And that's because there are just vastly more ways to get a universe that can't permit life than to get a universe that can permit life. It's therefore very, 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 very improbable that life would exist given naturalism. Now, there's a lot more to say here, but this is just a very quick defense of my first premise. Now, on the other hand, life is not so improbable on theism. God has a particular reason to create us because we are embodied moral agents. We basically have the ability to make moral choices. We can choose between right and wrong. We have the ability to harm people, but we can also use our freedom in order to do good things and exemplify goods like compassion, love, forgiveness, and that type of thing. So it's not incredibly surprising that God would have reason or would want to create a universe that can support embodied conscious creatures like us that have the ability to make moral choices. So even though universes that can't permit life vastly outnumber universes that can permit life, it's not so unlikely or so unexpected that God would want to choose and select a universe that can permit life. That's a quick defensive premise too. So think of it like this. Here's an analogy. There's billions and trillions of ways to combine different chunks of metal and plastic. Now, it's certainly possible to organize these materials into a Ferrari, but just sort of like throwing them together by chance, you're probably not going to get anything that resembles a car, much less a Ferrari or sports car. To get a Ferrari, you need someone to intentionally select what to make out of all the possible combinations. And by the way, this is what a good analogy looks like. So from the first two premises of my argument, it follows that a life-permitting universe provides pretty good evidence for theism over naturalism. That's the fine-tuning argument, my favorite version of the fine-tuning argument in a nutshell. All right, so now let's turn to the puddle analogy and get clear, first of all, on exactly what it is, what it's supposed to be saying. The puddle analogy was made famous by an English author named Douglas Adams. He's actually the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, I haven't read the book, I hear it's really good, but I actually really like the movie. He's obviously a very, very talented writer, and he just seems like a really brilliant guy. So here's a clip of him actually giving the analogy.
And it's rather like a puddle waking up one morning. I know they don't normally do this, but allow me, I'm a science fiction writer. A puddle wakes up one morning and thinks, this is a very interesting world I find myself in. It fits me very neatly. In fact, it fits me so neatly, I mean, really precise, isn't it? It must have been made to have me in it. And the sun rises, and he's continuing to narrate the story about this hole being made to have him in it. And the sun rises, and gradually the puddle is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And by the time the puddle ceases to exist, it's still thinking, it's still trapped in this idea that the hole was there for it. And if we think the world is here for us, we will continue to destroy it in the way that we've been destroying it.
Now, it seems to me that Adam's original point is something like this. As our environment gets worse and worse and worse, or in other words, as the puddle continues to shrink, then we don't really care, everything's okay because it was designed for us. What's unique about this interpretation is that atheists are very rarely using the puddle analogy as a reason to care about the environment. But that seems to be exactly what Adams was getting at, right? He's talking about a puddle getting smaller and smaller. So call this interpretation 1. Environmentalism. A second, more popular interpretation of the puddle analogy is that just because something appears designed to you doesn't mean that it's actually designed. Call this interpretation 2, appearances can be deceiving. This is the interpretation that Drew, over at Genetically Modified Skeptic, seems to endorse in the following clip.
The analogy directly acknowledges that the universe appears designed, and it poses an explanation for why that appearance is deceiving. The analogy just shifts perspectives, presenting the possibility that the universe existed first and that we, in our evolution, came to exist as a creature which fits its pre-existing environment.
Now here, Drew actually admits that the analogy acknowledges that the universe appears designed, but appearances can be deceiving. For Drew, the puddle analogy is meant to get us to consider the possibility that we were shaped to live in our environment, rather than the other way around, rather the environment being created for us. A third interpretation of the puddle analogy is that it's really like arrogance or self-centeredness that makes us conclude or infer that the universe was designed for us. The world is just so beautiful. I'm just so amazing. I'm so arrogant, and the world must have been designed for me. Arrogance, self-centeredness prevents us from considering the possibility that the universe wasn't created especially for us. Call this interpretation 3, arrogantly designed. A fourth interpretation of the analogy is that life was shaped by the conditions of our universe, but different life might emerge in universes with different conditions. Just as puddles take the shape of their container, life takes the shape of its environment. Call this interpretation 4, different universe, different life. A fifth interpretation of the puddle analogy is that just like the puddle could only observe the shape that it takes, life can only observe a life-permitting universe. If the universe couldn't permit life, then obviously we wouldn't be here thinking about it, talking about it. Our observations, in other words, necessitate a life-permitting universe. The puddle shouldn't be drawing conclusions about why it takes the shape that it does. It has to take that shape. Likewise, life shouldn't be asking, why does the universe have life? It has to have life. Call this interpretation 5, life is necessary. Now, let's just sort of take note of what's happened so far. We've looked at 5 different interpretations of the puddle analogy. 5. That's not a good sign. Analogies are not supposed to be ambiguous. They're supposed to be clear and obvious. I mean, that's why we use analogies. They're supposed to make a very, very clear point. But the true point of the puddle analogy is elusive. No one, like literally no one, not even the atheists that I've asked about this, can agree on what the point of the puddle analogy is. And my prediction is that even though I've tried to be literally as charitable as possible in addressing the puddle analogy, I'm still going to get people telling me that I just don't understand it. I haven't considered this other interpretation of the puddle analogy. This is not a good sign. If no one can understand the point that you're trying to make, maybe you don't really understand the point that you're trying to make. So 2 more quick points here is that the puddle analogy is probably not something that people have analyzed at this depth. So hearing me analyze it and draw out different interpretations is probably going to seem at odds with their intuitions about it. That's fine. This level of analysis is meant to do that. It's meant to draw out the reasoning explicitly so that we can take a closer look at it. That's sort of what analytic philosophy is all about. The second point is that a lot of people will want to combine different interpretations of the puddle analogy, and that's also fine. Like if you think that interpretations 3, 4, and 5 are the main point of the analogy, that's okay. I've just split the reasoning out so that we can all see it explicitly. All right, so now let's analyze these 5 different interpretations and see what can be said about them. The first interpretation of the analogy is that thinking we're designed makes us care less about the environment. As the puddle gets smaller and smaller, or in other words, as the environment gets worse and worse, we don't really care because ultimately we still think that the universe was designed for us. First, let's quickly note that this is not an objection to the fine-tuning argument or the argument from design. That's not the point. He's not saying the universe wasn't designed for us. Rather, what he's saying is that design makes us care less about the environment. It's a kind of moral critique. Now, keeping that distinction in mind, I think he's actually right. Thinking that the universe was designed can lead to carelessness. Some sects of Christians, and I hate to admit this, a lot of Christians think that they don't really need to care about the environment because the second coming of Christ is going to be here and he's going to fix everything. Now, I think theologically, this is a complete mistake. That God designed the universe for us doesn't mean that we shouldn't take care of it. I think the opposite is actually implied. And if I can talk about Christianity in particular for a second, the Bible actually teaches the opposite. Genesis 1 explains that humans are held accountable as stewards over the earth. Psalm 24 says that the earth is the Lord's. Numbers 35 instructs us to keep the land pure and to not pollute it. Revelation 11 says that God will punish the destroyers of the earth. 1 Corinthians 6 says that our bodies are temples and should therefore be taken care of. Now, if I was tasked as like a steward over someone's house, obviously I'd be held responsible if I completely trashed it out and like lit it on fire. And so likewise, as stewards over God's creation, I think that we have a responsibility to take care of it and make sure that it's healthy. Another point here is that belief in naturalism doesn't automatically make one an environmentalist. We can imagine a naturalist sort of understanding that the heat death of the universe implies that humans are eventually going to die out, and therefore he would just sort of not care about what happens. Whether I take care of the environment now or I don't, like everything is going to die one day, so why do all this extra work? Now, I'm not saying that this is the right mindset, nor am I saying that this is even a rational mindset. I'm just pointing out that in the same way that a theist can reason that design implies we don't have to care about environment, naturalism can imply that we shouldn't care about the environment. My major point in response to interpretation 1 is that this is not an objection to the fine-tuning argument. It was never designed to be that way, pun intended. It's completely unrelated, so let's move on. All right, so the second interpretation is that just because something looks designed doesn't mean that it is designed. Now, I know this is going to shock a lot of atheists out there, but I agree. Just because something looks designed doesn't mean that it is designed. But it also doesn't mean that it isn't designed. Have you ever heard of an artificial lake? Have you ever seen a pool? Have you ever seen a coffee mug? Have you ever seen a water beaker? Some bodies of water are designed to be the exact dimensions that they are. The appearance of design can go wrong but it can also go right. So then how do we know, how do we tell if something is designed or not? Well, this interpretation of the puddle analogy isn't going to answer that question. It can't tell us if something is designed or not. All it says is that appearances can be deceiving. I mean, okay, but we're sort of still left wondering whether or not the body of water in question was designed to fit that shape. And so ultimately, it's still going to come down, as it always does, to the evidence. It's not enough to just say that appearances can be deceiving. It's not enough. In other words, we still need to evaluate the fine-tuning argument and determine whether or not the premises are true. And this objection might work against some versions of the fine-tuning argument, but it doesn't say anything about mine. That appearances can be deceiving, it doesn't suddenly follow that a life-permitting universe is expected or likely on naturalism. So somewhat surprisingly, this interpretation of the puddle analogy is completely consistent with my version of the fine-tuning argument being sound. The second point here is that the appearance of design may not prove design with 100% certainty, but that was never the goal. The goal of the fine-tuning argument is to provide evidence for design, not to prove it with 100% certainty. If I go out into the woods and I find what looks like an arrowhead, I may not have 100% proof of design, like it still could have been produced by natural forces, but I at least have some evidence that this thing was designed. Similarly, if the puddle finds itself in a transparent container with like numbers and markings on the side of it, that's not 100% proof of design, but it should nevertheless follow the evidence and conclude design. The third point is that we don't need to follow possibilities, we need to follow evidence. Recently, I've unfortunately been dealing with a lot of health anxiety. When I get a new pain in my chest, I'm even experiencing a little right now, sometimes my brain wants to think, oh my goodness, I have cancer, I'm about to die. Even though that's like the least likely possibility. I mean, I can entertain the possibility of cancer as long as I want and get really worked up about it, but that doesn't mean that I probably have cancer. So when Drew says that the analogy is meant to get us to consider the possibility that the universe wasn't designed for us, that is not evidence for naturalism. Considering the possibility that I have cancer does not make it likely that I have cancer. We don't need to follow possibilities, we need to follow the evidence. All right, moving on. So now we're on to the third interpretation of the analogy, which says that it's arrogance or kind of self-centeredness that makes us conclude design. Let me first focus on the power of this thought, because it's actually pretty powerful. Notice that it brings in like a moral and psychological element into the whole situation. We're no longer just talking about evidence. Theists that infer design from fine-tuning aren't just wrong, they're being influenced or motivated by selfish reasons. This is an excellent use of rhetoric. Excellent. It's a way of persuading people without an argument, like no argument at all. Notice that Adams didn't give an argument that people are motivated by narcissism or arrogance or self-centeredness. He just kind of told a story and went with it. But why can't design inferences be made with caution and humility? C.S. Lewis actually invented a name for this type of rhetoric. He called it bulverism. Instead of explaining why someone is wrong, you just assume they're wrong and then explain what motivates them. Check out the following clip.
In other words, you must show that a man is wrong before you start explaining why he is wrong. The modern method is to assume without discussion that he is wrong, and then distract his attention from this, the only real issue, by busily explaining how he became so silly. In the course of the last 15 years, I have found this vice so common that I have had to invent a name for it. I call it bulverism. Some day I am going to write the biography of its imaginary inventor, Ezekiel Bulver, whose destiny was determined at the age of 5 when he heard his mother say to his father, who had been maintaining that 2 sides of a triangle were together greater than the third, "Oh, you say that because you are a man." At that moment, E. Bulver assures us, there flashed across my opening mind the great truth that refutation is no necessary part of argument. Assume that your opponent is wrong, and then explain his error, and the world will be at your feet.
Bulverism is such an effective strategy because it puts people on the defensive. We're no longer defending an argument, we're defending our own reputation. From a rhetorical standpoint, this is great stuff. But from a dialectical standpoint, it's garbage. Explaining why someone is motivated to hold design or infer design doesn't say anything about the truth or falsity of their arguments. Even if someone is arrogant or self-centered, it doesn't suddenly follow that a life-permitting universe is now likely or expected on naturalism. This objection is actually just a red herring. It's like a clever distraction from the actual issue, from the fine-tuning argument. Atheists that are watching this, don't take the bait. Don't take it. Shift the focus back to the argument. Here's a question you can ask when you find yourself in this situation. Now look, I understand that you think design inferences are sort of influenced by self-centeredness. I get that. But let's shelf it for a moment and let's get back to the argument. Like, which premise in my argument is false, and then explain why. To the atheists watching that use this kind of strategy, like just assuming that theists are wrong and then going the route of explaining their motives is not a long-term strategy. It's called bulverism. At some point, you're still going to need to interact with the arguments. So eventually you're going to have to do that. Oh, and by that, I don't mean like interact with the weakest possible versions of the arguments. I mean like interact with the strongest ones that are in the literature, defended by professional philosophers, that kind of thing. Don't rely on Wikipedia. All right, so let's move on. The fourth interpretation is that just like a differently shaped puddle would form in a differently shaped hole, different life would form in a different universe with different conditions. We just happen to find ourselves in a universe where our kind of life emerged. The benefit of this interpretation is that finally we're taking aim at the argument. If this objection works, it would mean that life is not so unlikely, not so unexpected on naturalism. But the problem is that this is just a complete misunderstanding of fine-tuning. Universes with slightly different conditions can't support life at all. Removing gravity doesn't make it the case that different life would emerge. It makes it impossible for life to emerge. Stars, galaxies, and planets would never form. The chemistry needed for evolution could never emerge. Life can't exist where fundamental particles don't stick together. And this is where this interpretation of the puddle analogy just completely breaks down. And that's fine. Like, analogies all break down at some point. Changing the shape of the container might change the shape of the puddle, but changing the conditions of the universe doesn't just change the shape of life, it makes life impossible. Life can't exist in a universe with nothing but black holes. Life can't exist where neighboring particles are trillions of light years away. So this interpretation of the puddle analogy fails to appreciate the severity of fine-tuning. The first premise of my argument is therefore on pretty solid grounds. For a more in-depth look at the evidence for fine-tuning the stuff I've been talking about, check the link in the description where I talked with an actual cosmologist, Dr. Luke Barnes, about it. So again, description. All right, so now we're on the last interpretation of the analogy, the fifth interpretation, which says that life is necessary. Just like the puddle can only observe the shape that it takes, life can only observe a life-permitting universe. If the universe couldn't permit life, then obviously we wouldn't be here wondering why it permits life. Like the previous interpretation, this one actually targets the argument, targets the first premise. Life is not so unexpected on naturalism because life has to exist. Now, it may surprise you to learn this, but this objection actually has a name, and it was answered about 3 decades ago. In 1989, a Canadian philosopher by the name of John Leslie wrote this amazing book, which is still worth reading today, called Universes, where he gives an analogy in order to explain why this reasoning breaks down. And by the way, his analogy doesn't entail that people that disagree with it are arrogant and self-centered, so at least it has that going for it. So here's astronomer Deborah Harasma, hopefully that's the way you pronounce that. Here's her explaining what the firing squad analogy is.
John Leslie has suggested this analogy. Say there's a criminal who's up to be executed, and he stands before a firing squad. Firing squad has a dozen members. They all are sharpshooters. They all have their guns pointed right at his head. The commandant says fire. They all fire. And the accused walks away free. And for some reason, he's not killed. Well, is he going to say, well, of course I wasn't killed. I'm here, and if I was killed, I wouldn't be here to wonder about it. No, he's going to want to know why. What happened? Were there no bullets? What was going on? You still need an explanation. The weak anthropic principle doesn't really explain why the universe is the way it is. So there's still something further to explain there.
So here's another way of understanding Leslie's response. That A entails B doesn't mean that A explains B. For example, my observing a broken window might entail that a window is broken, but that doesn't explain why the window is broken. Similarly, our observing a life-permitting universe might entail that a life-permitting universe exists, but that doesn't explain why a life-permitting universe exists. Atheists might still worry here that this analogy doesn't work because it assumes that other possibilities are actually possible. It's possible, for example, that instead of missing, the firing squad actually shot the guy. But for all we know, the universe had to absolutely be this way. It's necessary that it's this way. Maybe it's not even possible that the universe was different, which would mean that the objective probability of giving a life-permitting universe is 1 out of 1. Here is a major problem with this view. it renders design inferences about the world, really obvious ones, it renders them impossible. For example, suppose that Curiosity, the NASA rover currently on Mars, was going around, looking around, and in one of the caves, it found a fully functioning Ferrari. I think pretty much everyone would conclude that the Ferrari was designed. It was put there by somebody. But if this is the only possible universe, then actually the objective probability that that Ferrari sitting in that cave is 1 out of 1. This is actually a really serious problem, not just for design inferences, but about probability more generally. Here's Dr. Luke Barnes explaining all the problems with this thinking.
Yeah, you do hear this. Some people say, probabilities are, I observe one universe, and out of that one universe, one is life permitting, so the probability is 1 out of 1. And I mean, there had better be a better idea about probability than that, or science is in big trouble. Because every theory, imagine there's some data that's turned up, and that you've got 5 theories, and you go, all right, what do you reckon? And all 5 of them go, well, look, there's one universe, and that's the data in that universe, so the probability of that data is 1 out of 1. My theory is fine, the probability is 100%. And then the next guy says the same, and then the next person says, and all 5. There'd better be something else that we can say about probabilities other than I observed one thing, and so the probability is 1 out of 1. If that's true, we can't use probability for anything.
Luke's point here is that if you want to say that the probability of getting a life-permitting universe is 1 out of 1, then be ready to throw science and reason and probability, be ready to throw it away. Don't use it anymore. In summary, we looked at 5 interpretations of the puddle analogy. The first interpretation says that the idea of design can make us care less about the environment. In response, I agreed that it can, but argued that it shouldn't. The Bible makes it clear that we are going to be held accountable for our stewardship of the world. I also pointed out that this objection is irrelevant to my argument from fine-tuning. The second interpretation says that appearances can be deceiving. And there I argued 3 different things. First, the fallibility of design inferences doesn't interact with my argument and hence can't tell us whether the universe is designed or not. Second, the fine-tuning argument doesn't seek to prove design, it seeks to provide evidence for design. And third, we don't need to follow possibilities, we need to follow evidence. The third interpretation is that thinking the world was created especially for us is self-centered. In response, I explained how this engages in what C.S. Lewis called bulverism. Assume your interlocutor is wrong and then explain what motivates them. This is rhetorically effective but fails dialectically. It doesn't say anything about the validity of the fine-tuning argument. The fourth interpretation of the puddle analogy says that different universes might produce different life. In response to this, I said that this misunderstands what physicists mean by fine-tuning. Life can't emerge in a universe full of nothing but black holes. The fifth interpretation says that life is necessary. In response to this, we heard John Leslie's firing squad analogy, saw that just because A entails B doesn't mean that A explains B, and then saw that the thinking behind this objection would actually destroy all probabilistic reasoning. All in all, the puddle analogy fails no matter which way you look at it. Well guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video on the puddle analogy. If you think I'm wrong about the puddle analogy or you didn't like my responses to the interpretations that I did cover, make sure to let me know in the comments. If there's enough comments and enough upvotes, I might make another video on it. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and if you loved it, then hit the subscribe button so you can be notified when I post more videos. Also, Christianity is true.